The morning Eliza Calloway found her husband's side of the bed cold and the tin box beneath the floorboards emptied of every last coin they had saved over 6 years of marriage, she did not cry. She stood in the doorway of their small rented room above the saloon in Dodge City, Kansas, and felt the world fall completely silent around her. It was the autumn of 1878, and the cattle drives had slowed their summer roar to a low, tired groan. The plains stretched out beyond the single window, like a sea that offered no shore, and Eliza pressed her hand flat against the window pane and tried to remember the last time Thomas Calloway had looked at her the way a husband was supposed to look at a wife. She could not remember. The truth was, she realized with a hollow certainty that settled in her chest like cold river water, that she had known something was wrong for a long time. She had simply chosen not to see it. The tin box had held $42.30, money she had earned herself taking in laundry and mending shirts for the cowboys who came through on the cattle drives. Thomas had worked as a card dealer at the Long Branch Saloon, and his wages, he always claimed, barely covered the cost of their rent. She had believed him. She had made herself believe him, the same way she had made herself believe that the smell of cheap perfume on his collar was from the ladies who walked too close in the crowded streets, and that the long nights he did not come home were because the games ran late and he slept at the saloon rather than disturb her rest. She pulled open the small wardrobe. His clothes were gone. Every shirt, every pair of trousers, the good hat he wore on Sundays. The only thing he had left behind was a single boot. One boot, as though he had packed in such haste or such contempt that he could not be bothered to notice he had dropped it. Eliza picked up the boot and stared at it for a long moment. Then she set it down very carefully on the floor, walked to the small cracked mirror above the wash basin, and studied her own face. She was 24 years old. She had brown hair the color of creek water in autumn, eyes that were gray-green depending on the light, and a jaw that her mother had always said was too stubborn for a woman to wear gracefully. She was not beautiful in the way that the girls downstairs were beautiful, the kind of beauty that was arranged and painted and offered for a price. She was something more durable than that, though she did not feel durable at this particular moment. She felt hollow and used and absolutely alone. The landlady, Mrs. Pickford, knocked on the door before Eliza had finished washing her face. The woman was not unkind, but she was practical, in the way that everyone in Dodge City was practical, because sentiment was a luxury the frontier could not always afford. "Mr. Calloway paid through the end of last month," Mrs. Pickford said, standing in the doorway with her arms folded across her wide bosom. "We are 4 days into October. I will need payment by the end of the week, or I will need the room, Mrs. Calloway. I am sorry for your situation." Eliza nodded. "I understand," she said. Her voice was steady, and that surprised her. "There is work at the laundry on 2nd Street, Mrs. Pickford offered, and her voice softened just enough to let Eliza know the woman had seen situations like this before. "Mrs. Hargrove takes on girls sometimes." "Thank you," Eliza said. When the door closed, Eliza sat on the edge of the bed and allowed herself 30 seconds of grief. She counted them in her head, the way her father had taught her to count through hard things, one heartbeat at a time, no more, no less. At 30, she stood up. She had no family in Kansas. Her parents were dead, both of them gone to a fever when she was 19, and she had married Thomas Calloway 6 months later, because she had been young and frightened, and he had seemed at the time like solid ground. She had a cousin somewhere in Missouri, but they had not spoken in years, and she had no money for a train ticket in any direction. She went to Mrs. Hargrove's laundry and was told there was no work available. She went to the dry goods store and asked Mr. Abernathy if he needed help behind the counter. He looked her up and down with something she did not like and said he might have something for her if she came back that evening. She did not go back. She spent the next 2 days asking at every respectable establishment in Dodge City and found nothing. The cattle season was winding down. The cowboys were heading back south, and Dodge City in October was not a town flush with opportunity for a woman alone with no references and no money and a last name that belonged to a man who had, she learned through the sharp network of gossip that connected every woman in every frontier town, run off with the daughter of a rancher from Wichita. A girl of 20, they said. had been seeing her all summer. The humiliation of that knowledge was something Eliza packed away very deliberately into a back corner of herself where she did not intend to visit it until she was somewhere safer. By the third day, she had sold the boot, one boot, absurdly, to a one-legged veteran who ran a small shoe repair operation near the stock pens for 15 cents. She had eaten 2 meals in 3 days. Mrs. Pickford left a plate of biscuits outside her door without comment, and Eliza ate them standing at the window, watching the dust blow down the main street of Dodge City in long golden sheets. On the morning of the 4th day, a woman named Pearl Dawson found her. Pearl was somewhere in her 50s, broad-shouldered and sun-browned, with silver hair she wore in a single thick braid down her back and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. She ran a small supply store at the edge of town, the kind of store that stocked goods for trappers and hunters and the people who lived far enough from civilization that they needed to plan ahead. She had come to collect laundry from Mrs. Pickford and had apparently been told by Mrs. Pickford about Eliza's situation. "I hear you are in a difficult spot," Pearl said, sitting herself down at the small table in Eliza's room without being invited, which Eliza found she could not resent because it was done with such complete matter-of-fact confidence. "That is one way to describe it," Eliza said. Pearl studied her for a moment. "Can you cook?" "Yes." "Can you keep accounts? Read and write?" "I can. My father was a school teacher." Pearl nodded slowly. "Can you handle being far from town? I mean far, not a short ride." Eliza looked around the small room, at the empty wardrobe and the cracked mirror and the single boot she had not yet gotten around to throwing away. "I do not think distance is going to be my biggest problem right now," she said. Pearl almost smiled. "I know a man who needs a cook and a housekeeper. He lives about 14 miles out up in the hills to the west. He's not an easy man, and the work is hard. He pays fair wages, better than fair actually, because no one will take the job. He has had 2 housekeepers in the last year, and both of them lasted less than a month." She paused. "He is not cruel. He is just very large and very quiet, and he lives alone, and people find him unsettling. I've known Caleb Holt for 11 years, and I will tell you plainly that he is one of the best men I have ever met. He just does not know how to show it in ways that ordinary people find comfortable." "Caleb Holt," Eliza repeated. "Mountain man, more or less. Came out here from Tennessee about 12 years ago. Traps, hunts, sells hides and meat, has a good piece of land. He built his own cabin with his own hands, and it's a better structure than anything in town." Pearl leaned forward slightly. "He is not a violent man. I want to be clear about that. He's not a drunk, and he's not the kind of man who bothers women. He just needs someone to run his household so he can focus on what he is good at." Eliza thought about Mr. Abernathy and his offer. She thought about the empty tin box. She thought about the biscuits left outside her door like she was a charity case, which, she supposed, she was. "When can I meet him?" she asked. Pearl smiled properly then, and it changed her whole face. "He comes into town on Fridays for supplies. That is tomorrow." Eliza met Caleb Holt the following morning in Pearl's supply store, and the first thing she registered, standing behind Pearl's counter with a catalog open in front of her as Pearl had suggested, was that the man who walked through the door was not what she had expected. She was not sure what she had expected. Something rough and unkempt, perhaps, something that would make it easy to remain practical about this arrangement. What she got instead was a man who was enormous in the way that mountains are enormous, not threatening exactly, but impossible to ignore. He was well over 6 feet with shoulders that seemed to require the doorframe to expand slightly to accommodate them, and he was built with the kind of hard, dense muscle that came from a decade of actual physical labor rather than any vanity. His hair was dark brown and longer than was fashionable, reaching past the collar of his flannel shirt in loose waves, and he had a short beard, darker along the jaw, that was neat enough to suggest he cared about his appearance without being a man who was consumed by it. His hands, when he set his list on Pearl's counter, were large and scarred and completely steady. He was 32 years old. Pearl had told Eliza this beforehand. He did not look 32. He looked like something that had been formed by the land itself. His eyes, when they found Eliza, were dark amber, not quite brown, not quite gold, and they assessed her in a single direct look that was not rude but was entirely unvarnished. He was not a man who bothered with the social performance of pretending not to look at something he needed to evaluate. "This is Eliza Calloway," Pearl said, moving around the counter with the ease of long familiarity. "I told you about her situation." "You did," Caleb said. His voice was low and unhurried and came from somewhere deep in his chest. He looked at Eliza. "Can you cook on a wood stove?" "Yes," Eliza said. "It is a long winter up there. Some weeks the weather makes it impossible to come to town. Are you comfortable with that?" "I am more comfortable with that than I am with the alternative," Eliza said. Something shifted in those amber eyes. Not quite a smile, but an acknowledgement of something. "The pay is $12 a month plus room and board," he said. "Separate room. I will put a lock on the door if you want one." Eliza straightened. "I would appreciate that." He nodded once. "I leave at noon. Be ready." He turned back to his supply list, and Pearl, catching Eliza's eye, gave her a small nod that managed to convey both encouragement and the suggestion that she not waste any time standing around. Eliza was packed and ready at Pearl's store by 11:30. Her worldly possessions fit into a single carpet bag and a small wooden box that had belonged to her mother, a few books, her sewing kit, an extra dress, the practical items of a woman who had learned not to own more than she could carry. Pearl pressed a parcel of food into her hands as she left, fresh bread and salt pork and a small jar of preserves, and held her hands for a moment before letting go. "You're going to be all right," Pearl said. "I know," Eliza said, because she had decided that she was, even if she did not entirely feel it yet. The ride out to Caleb Holt's place took the better part of 2 hours. He drove a sturdy wagon pulled by 2 horses, both of them well kept, their coats brushed and their hooves sound, which told Eliza something about the man that she filed away carefully. They rode mostly in silence, which she found less uncomfortable than she had anticipated. He was not the kind of man who filled silence with noise for the sake of filling it, and she was not either. And somewhere in that shared quiet she felt the grinding anxiety of the last 4 days begin to loosen its grip on her chest just slightly. The country changed as they left Dodge City behind. The flat, wide openness of the Kansas plains gave way to something more textured, gentle rises and shallow valleys, the grass going amber and copper in the October light, cottonwood trees along the creek lines flaring gold. The sky was enormous and achingly blue, and there was a smell in the air, clean and cold and carrying the distant promise of winter that was the most alive thing Eliza had smelled in months. She did not realize she had exhaled until she heard herself do it. Caleb glanced at her sideways. He said nothing, but he did not look away immediately either. The cabin was not what she had expected. She had imagined something crude, a rough structure of bare logs with gaps in the chinking and a dirt floor. What she found instead was a solid, carefully built structure of thick pine logs, perfectly chinked, with a real plank floor and 2 proper windows with glass panes and a wide porch across the front. There was a woodshed attached to the side, stacked with more cut wood than she had ever seen outside of a lumberyard, and a small barn set back from the cabin, and beyond it, fenced pasture, where 2 more horses grazed alongside what appeared to be a small herd of goats. Inside, the cabin was 2 rooms, a main room that served as kitchen and living space, with a massive stone fireplace that took up most of one wall, and a wood stove in the kitchen area that was the finest piece of equipment in the room, and a sleeping room at the back where Caleb apparently slept. Off the main room, through a short hall, was a smaller room, barely more than a closet with ambitions, that held a narrow bed, a small dresser, and a wooden stool. "This would be yours," he said, opening the door to the small room. "I will put the lock on tonight." The room was clean. That surprised her too, not because she had expected filth, but because cleanliness in a bachelor's quarters 14 miles from town was a choice that required effort, and the deliberateness of that effort said something. "It is good," she said. "Thank you." He put the lock on the door that evening, working with the quiet efficiency of a man who was competent at most physical tasks and did not need to make a production of any of them. Eliza stood in the main room and unpacked Pearl's parcel of food into the larder, taking stock of what was there. The larder was well stocked in a utilitarian way. Plenty of dried beans and cornmeal, salt and coffee, cured meat and dried fruit, but it had the organizational logic of a man who cooked only when he was hungry, rather than a kitchen managed with any real system. She reorganized it. She could not help herself. It was the kind of task that her hands needed, something orderly and concrete after 4 days of chaos. When Caleb came back in from the barn that evening, he found her at the wood stove making cornbread and frying up salt pork with onions from the small string of dried onions that hung near the larder. He stopped in the doorway of the kitchen and looked at the reorganized shelves and the neat row of supplies she had arranged on the counter. "You moved things," he said. "I did. I hope that's all right. There's now a clear logic to where everything is." She paused, turning from the stove. "I should have asked first." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the shelves. Then, "No, it is fine. The way I had it made no sense." She almost smiled at that. "The cornbread will be ready in about 15 minutes, she said. He hung his coat on the peg by the door and washed his hands at the basin and sat down at the table. He was close enough that she was suddenly very aware of how large he was, not in a frightening way, but in the way of a physical fact that could not be ignored. When he moved through the space of the cabin, he moved carefully, like a man who had spent years being conscious of taking up more room than most people, who had learned to be deliberate so as not to inadvertently knock things over. They ate in silence, mostly. The food was simple. She had not had much to work with, but he cleaned his plate completely, which she took as a good sign. "It is good," he said when he set his fork down. "Better than what I make." "What do you make?" she asked. "Beans, usually just beans." She looked at him. There was something so completely unself-conscious about the answer that she found herself fighting the urge to laugh, not unkindly but genuinely, the first real impulse toward laughter she had felt in days. "I can do considerably better than beans," she said. "I figured," he said. He pushed his chair back and went to sit by the fireplace with a pipe, and Eliza washed the dishes and listened to the fire and the distant cry of a coyote somewhere out in the darkening hills, and felt for the first time in 4 days something that was not quite hope, but was at least the shape of it. The first week was a careful negotiation between two very private people sharing a small space. Eliza established her routines quickly, because routines were what kept her sane, up before dawn to start the fire and put the coffee on, breakfast prepared by the time Caleb came in from his morning chores, the cabin cleaned and organized in the mornings, then the afternoons spent on whatever needed doing, mending, baking bread, preparing the evening meal, tending the kitchen garden that still had some late-season root vegetables in the ground. She was not accustomed to the silence of the hills, not at first. After Dodge City, with its constant noise, the cattle lowing, the piano music from the saloon, the boots on the boardwalks, the shouts of drovers, the quiet here was so complete that she could hear her own heartbeat. She could hear the wind in the grass and the creak of the pine trees on the ridge above the cabin and the soft movements of the horses in the barn. It was, she discovered within a few days, not an absence of sound, but a different kind of sound, one that required retuning her ears to hear. Caleb himself contributed to the quiet by simply being a man who said only what needed to be said. He was not cold, she had braced herself for coldness, but he was contained in the way of a man who had lived alone for long enough that his interior life had become the primary country he inhabited. He thanked her for meals. He asked if she needed anything when he went to town. He repaired a squeaking hinge on the kitchen cabinet without her asking, and left a bundle of dried sage on the windowsill one morning because, she assumed, he had noticed her adding it to the beans and running out. She did not ask about his past. He did not ask about hers. The arrangement had a kind of professional dignity to it that she found enormously restoring after the humiliation of the last months of her marriage. On the 8th day, she found a half-finished carving on the workbench near the woodshed, a small figure of a bear rendered in pine, detailed with a patience and care that surprised her. She stood looking at it for longer than she intended, turning it in her hands, running her thumb along the fine lines of the bear's shoulders and the delicate suggestion of its face. "It is not finished," she startled. Caleb was standing behind her, not close, but she had not heard him come up. She turned, holding the carving. "I am sorry," she said. "I did not mean to touch your things." He shook his head. "It does not matter." He came to stand beside her and looked at the carving in her hands. "I do them in the evening sometimes. when the trapping is slow and the winter sets in. "You are very good at it," she said, and she meant it entirely. He looked at her when she said that, as though checking whether the compliment was genuine or merely polite. He must have decided it was genuine, because something in his face eased slightly. "I make them for the trading post in town sometimes. Pearl sells them." "Pearl did not mention that," Eliza said. "Pearl does not mention most things about me," he said, with what she was beginning to recognize as his version of dry humor, completely deadpan, offered and withdrawn so quickly that you almost missed it. She set the bear down carefully and went back inside, and that evening at dinner, he placed the finished bear on the table beside her plate without comment and went back to eating his stew. She looked at it, then at him. He was looking at his bowl. "Thank you," she said softly. He nodded once, and that was all, but the small carved bear sat on her windowsill from that night forward, and she could not have said exactly when she began to think of it as something more than a kind gesture, when it became, instead, a beginning. The second week brought rain, cold and relentless, sheeting down from a sky the color of pewter. The creek at the bottom of the property ran up brown and fast, and the goats had to be brought into the barn, which Caleb did in the early morning while Eliza stood on the porch and watched him carry two of them bodily when they refused to cooperate, one tucked under each arm like oversized, indignant packages. She pressed her hand over her mouth to keep from laughing, and he glanced up, rain-soaked, and there was something in his expression, a brief, startled awareness of being seen, that was so unguarded she felt it like a small impact somewhere behind her sternum. She made beef stew that evening with the last of the dried vegetables and some turnips she had pulled from the garden before the hard rain started, and she baked an apple cake from the dried apples in the larder, because the rain seemed like a day that called for something sweet. She had not baked anything sweet since before Thomas left, had not had the reason or the inclination, and she discovered, as the warm, spiced smell filled the cabin and pushed back against the gray, wet cold, that she had missed it. Caleb came in from the barn, soaked through, and stopped dead when the smell hit him. He stood in the doorway looking genuinely at a loss for words, which on a man of that considerable presence was an impressive sight. "Apple cake," she said. "I know what it smells like," he said. "I have not smelled that in a long time." There was something in his voice, a very private, very carefully wrapped something, that she chose not to press on. Not then. "Go change into dry clothes," she said instead. "Supper will be ready in 20 minutes. He did. When he came back to the table, his hair was damp from toweling and curling slightly at the ends, and he was in a clean shirt, and his boots were by the door, and he looked, in the warm, firelit light of the cabin, like a different person from the contained, careful man she had met in Pearl's store. He looked younger, less armored. He ate 3 slices of apple cake and did not seem embarrassed about it. "My mother made this," he said, between the second and third slice, not looking up from his plate. "On rainy days." Eliza was quiet for a moment. "Tennessee?" she asked. He looked up, surprised that she knew. "Pearl," he said. "Pearl," she confirmed. He nodded. "She died 6 years ago. I never went back." A pause. There was not anything to go back to. She did not ask more, but she heard what was underneath it, the weight of something that did not have a simple name, the particular grief of people who have been alone long enough that the loneliness has fused itself into the architecture of who they are. "My parents are gone too," she said, "both of them, 5 years ago." He was quiet. Then we are both without a country to go back to." She thought about that for a long time after he had gone to bed. She sat by the fire with her knitting in her lap, and the bear carved from pine on the table beside the lamp, and she thought about what it meant to be without a country, and whether the places we came from were the only countries we ever got, or whether a country was something you could find again somewhere new. The autumn deepened into a cold and brilliant November. The hills were extraordinary. The grass had gone the color of old gold, and the cottonwoods had dropped their leaves and stood silver-white against the blue sky. And in the mornings there was frost on the grass, and the horse's breath came in great white clouds. Eliza had found her rhythm in the work, and had found also, to her quiet surprise, that she was not merely surviving this arrangement. She was within it, something very much like content. She had learned the landscape immediately around the cabin well enough to walk it alone. The path down to the creek, the south-facing slope where the winter sun came longest, where she sometimes took her mending on fine afternoons, the granite outcropping on the ridge above that Caleb had showed her one evening when the sunset was particularly fierce, leading her up through the juniper scrub with a steadiness she had been grateful for because the path was rough, pointing out the view with the same lack of ceremony with which he did most things, as though the blazing orange and purple spectacle of a Kansas sunset from a high ridge were simply a fact to be noted rather than something that made the chest ache with its beauty. It made her chest ache. She was quite sure it made his too, from the way he stood looking at it, the wind in his long hair, his jaw set and his eyes on the far horizon. She had also learned enough about his trapping operation to understand why he needed help at the cabin. He was gone for long stretches, sometimes 2 or 3 days at a time, working a line of traps he had set along the creek drainages to the north and west, and during those stretches, the cabin had to be maintained, the animals tended, the fire kept so the pipes did not freeze. She managed it well, and he had told her so plainly on his return from a 3-day trip in early November, looking around the cabin and the woodshed and the barn with an assessing eye before telling her she had done well. She had told him he was welcome, and then he had handed her a small bundle of cedar he had brought back from the higher slopes, wrapped in a piece of cloth. "For the linen chest," he said, "keeps the moths out." She had stood holding the cedar and looked at him and said nothing for a moment, and he had seemed faintly alarmed by her silence, the way a man does who is accustomed to his small gestures going unremarked. "It is thoughtful," she said. "Thank you." He had nodded and gone to wash up, and she had pressed her face briefly into the cedar bundle because it smelled extraordinary, and because sometimes the body needed to celebrate small kindnesses in ways that had nothing to do with reason. It was in the middle of November, on a sharp, clear Saturday morning, that she told him about Thomas. She had not planned to. They were at the kitchen table after breakfast. She was going over the household accounts she kept in a small ledger she had bought in town, and he was cleaning and oiling his traps for the coming week, and she had been doing the arithmetic of how much she had earned in the 6 weeks she had been here, and had found herself thinking, for the first time in a while, about the tin box under the floorboards and all the work that had gone into filling it, and the morning she had found it empty. She did not realize she had made a sound until Caleb looked up from his work. "Are you all right?" he asked. She set down her pen. "I was married," she said. It came out without particular premeditation. "Until 6 weeks ago." "He left," she paused, "with another woman, and with all of our savings." Caleb set down the trap he was cleaning. He was very still. "The money I had saved doing laundry and mending for 5 years," she said. Her voice was matter of fact. She had processed the worst of it by now, she thought. "He left in the night, did not say a word. I found out later he had been seeing the other woman all summer. She was 20. A long silence. Then, "His name?" She looked at him. There was something very quiet and very focused in his face. "Thomas Calloway," she said, "though I imagine he has moved on considerably by now." "He left you with nothing." "He left me with myself," Eliza said, which turned out to be enough. Caleb looked at her for a long moment after she said that, a look she could not entirely read but that had a weight to it, a careful attention that she felt along her skin like heat from a fire. He picked up the trap again. "He was a fool," he said, simply, flatly, with the confidence of a man stating an empirical fact. She went back to her accounts, but her hand was not entirely steady and she was glad her hair was falling forward so he could not see her face. The first snow came in late November, not the season's killing blow, but a warning shot, 6 inches overnight that turned the world white and hushed and entirely beautiful in the morning. Eliza stood on the porch in her coat and watched it, and heard Caleb come to stand behind her, close enough that the warmth of him was perceptible through the cold air. "First snow of the year," he said. "It is beautiful," she said. "Wait until February," he said, and there was a rumbling something in his voice, humor, warmth, a note she was beginning to recognize as his particular register of happiness. She turned to look at him. The cold had put color in his face, and the snow was on his shoulders and in his dark hair, and he was looking at the white hills with an expression she could only describe as belonging, the look of a man in the place that was exactly his. "You love it here," she said. He looked at her then, and the morning light caught his amber eyes and turned them briefly gold. "Yes," he said, "more this year than last." She understood what he meant. She understood it so clearly that her breath caught and she looked away, back at the snow-covered hills, her heart making an entirely unauthorized series of movements inside her chest. She did not say anything for a moment. Then, "I should start breakfast." "I will bring in more wood first," he said. They went back inside, and neither of them spoke of it, but the words sat in the warm kitchen air between them, like something that had been set down and could not be picked back up and put away. December came in with a cold that was serious and intentional, the kind of cold that the land did not apologize for. The temperature dropped below freezing and stayed there, and the creek iced over at the edges, and Caleb spent his days preparing for the deep winter with the focused efficiency of a man who had survived enough Kansas winters to know exactly what was required. He cut and stacked more wood. He checked every inch of the cabin's chinking. He brought additional supplies back from town on a clear Thursday afternoon, filling the wagon with enough provisions to last well into February. Eliza helped him unload, handing things up from the wagon and watching him carry loads that would have required two ordinary men to manage, doing it with an ease that was not showing off, but simply the natural expression of what his body was built for. He caught her watching him once, and she did not look away, and he did not look away, and for the duration of 5 or 6 seconds they simply looked at each other in the cold afternoon air, with the horses shifting their feet behind him and the bare cottonwood trees clicking against the pale sky. Then a horse blew loudly, and they both moved at the same time, and the moment broke, and they carried the rest of the supplies inside without speaking. That evening, Pearl came. She arrived in her small wagon just at supper time, wind-burned and bundled in an enormous coat, and she brought with her a basket of things: a jar of hard candy, a newspaper from Wichita, some fabric she said was for Eliza if she wanted it, and a bottle of good whiskey for Caleb, which she pressed into his hand with the authority of a woman who had known him long enough to get away with it. They ate together. Eliza had made venison stew and fresh bread, and Pearl watched the two of them with the undisguised interest of a woman who had orchestrated a situation and was now checking on her investment. She was not subtle about it, but she was warm about it, and Eliza found she could not begrudge her the satisfaction she clearly felt. After supper, when Caleb had gone out to check the barn, Pearl sat across from Eliza with her hands wrapped around her coffee cup and looked at her with those eyes that missed nothing. "How are you?" she said. Not a question exactly. "Good," Eliza said. "Better than good." "He is looking at you differently than he has ever looked at anyone I have seen him look at," Pearl said. "I have known him 11 years. He does not look at people." Eliza was quiet for a moment. "Pearl," she said carefully. "I am not matchmaking," Pearl said, though her face suggested otherwise. "I am just telling you what I see, because you deserve to know what is real." Eliza thought about the morning on the porch, about the cedar, about the apple cake and his mother's rain-day kitchen and the carved bear on her windowsill, about the look in the cold afternoon light beside the wagon. "I am 6 weeks out of a marriage that destroyed me," she said quietly. "Yes," Pearl said, "and you are still here, and you are not destroyed. I noticed that." Caleb came back in from the barn, and Pearl shifted the conversation to town news, and Eliza sat with her coffee and felt the warmth of the cabin and the snow ticking against the windows and the big quiet presence of the man across the table, and let herself, for one private moment, consider what it might mean if what Pearl was saying was true. It was a week before Christmas when things shifted. Eliza had been attempting to make gingerbread from a recipe she had in her head from her mother's kitchen, a memory kitchen reconstructed from years of watching and helping, and she had made a mistake in the quantities, and the first batch had come out flat and sad. She was standing at the kitchen table staring at the collapsed gingerbread with her hands on her hips and a floury smear on her cheek when Caleb came in from outside. He looked at the gingerbread. He looked at her. "What happened?" "I put in too much soda, I think," she said, "or not enough flour. I have not made it in a long time, and I was trying to remember." He came and stood beside her, looking at the gingerbread. He was very close, close enough that she could feel the cold coming off his coat, and beneath it, the warmth of him. "My mother put honey in hers," he said. "I remember that. And a pinch of black pepper." She turned to look at him. He was looking at the gingerbread, not at her, but there was a softness in his face that was new, or not new, but newly visible, something that had been there for a while perhaps and was simply becoming harder to keep covered. "Black pepper," she repeated. "I would not have thought of that." She said it kept the sweetness from being too much. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I can tell you what I remember if you want to try again." They made gingerbread together. He sat at the kitchen table and told her what he could remember of his mother's recipe, hesitantly at first and then with more warmth as the memories came back. And she mixed and measured and asked questions, and the cabin filled up with the smell of ginger and cinnamon and that pinch of black pepper. And somewhere in the middle of it she realized that they had been talking, actually talking, easy and open, the way she had not talked with anyone in months, perhaps years, for the better part of an hour. The gingerbread came out right. She cut him a piece still warm from the pan, and he ate it standing at the counter with a look on his face that was so completely unguarded, so full of something she recognized as grief and sweetness and the peculiar ache of remembered things that she had to look away from it. "Thank you," he said, and it was not about the gingerbread, or not only. "Thank you for remembering," she said, and it was not only about the recipe either. He stood very still for a moment, and she stood very still, and the space between them in that warm kitchen was exactly as charged and exactly as fragile as the surface of a frozen pond in early spring. Then he set the plate down, and he said her name, Eliza, for the first time, she realized. He had been calling her nothing at all up until now, just presence and proximity and an avoidance of the need for names. "Yes," she said. He looked at her with those amber eyes that had gone very warm in the kitchen light. "I'm glad you are here," he said. It came out careful and true, and with the weight of a man who does not say things like that easily and knows it. She felt something inside her chest open like a window in spring, letting in air she had forgotten the taste of. "I'm glad to be here," she said. That was all. He picked up his hat from the peg and went back outside, and Eliza stood in her warm kitchen with the smell of gingerbread all around her, and her hand pressed flat against her sternum as though holding something in place, and she allowed herself, finally and fully and without apology, to admit that she was falling in love with Caleb Holt. Christmas was quiet and extraordinary. Eliza decorated the cabin with pine branches she cut herself on the south slope, fragrant dark green boughs that she arranged over the mantel and tied with strips of red fabric from Pearl's gift. She made a proper Christmas dinner from the good stores in the larder, roasted chicken from one of the hens that had stopped laying, potatoes and turnips, gravy, a dried fruit pudding that she steamed in a cloth the way her mother had done. Caleb disappeared for 2 hours on Christmas Eve and returned with 2 things: a small package wrapped in brown paper that he set on the table beside Eliza's plate without comment, and a wild turkey he had shot that morning, which meant there would be turkey on Christmas Day instead of chicken, which was better in every way. The package contained a pair of leather gloves, made to measure. She had not known he was a leather worker, but she would learn that he was a man of quietly diverse skills, soft and supple and lined with rabbit fur, the kind of gloves that would make all the outdoor work she did not just bearable, but genuinely comfortable through a Kansas winter. "You measured my hands," she said, pulling one on. It fit perfectly. Absolutely perfectly. "You leave your gloves on the peg by the door," he said. "I measured against those." She looked up at him. He had an expression on his face that she was coming to know very well, the expression of a man who has done something kind and is simultaneously hoping it is well received and pretending he would not care if it was not. "They are perfect," she said. "Caleb, they are really perfect." She had said his name back to him, his name, directly, deliberately, and his face did something complicated and beautiful when she did. She had made him something too. She had spent 3 evenings knitting him a pair of thick wool socks in dark blue because she had noticed his current pair were worn through at the heels. She gave them to him then, and he held them in his big hands and looked at them for a moment with an expression that she thought had something to do with the fact that no one had made him something in a very long time. "Thank you," he said. He His voice was rough around the edges. "Your heels are going to thank me more than you are," she said lightly, to give him a way out of the emotion if he needed it. He laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh fully. A real laugh, low and warm, rising up out of him with a kind of surprise at itself. She wanted to hear it again immediately. They sat by the fire that Christmas Eve, with the pine branches fragrant on the mantel and the wind building outside, and he played the harmonica. She had not known he played the harmonica, and she knitted the beginnings of a second pair of socks, and they talked, more that evening than they had talked in all the weeks combined, about Tennessee and about Kansas, and about his years of trapping and about her father's schoolroom where she had learned to read with a passion that had never left her, and about Pearl and the supply store and the strange gravitational force of a place that eventually became home. At some point the fire burned low and neither of them moved to add more wood, and the cabin was filled with the soft orange glow of coals and the smell of pine and the quiet sound of the wind. And Eliza looked at Caleb Holt sitting in his chair with the harmonica in his hand, and his long legs stretched toward the fire, and his face in that warm light. And she thought, this is what I wanted, and did not know how to ask for. This, a man who fills a room with safety, a man who makes things with his hands and remembers his mother's recipe for gingerbread and laughs with surprise at his own laughter. "I should turn in," she said. She did not move. "Yes," he said. He did not move either. "Merry Christmas, Caleb," she said. He looked at her. In the ember light, his eyes were entirely gold. "Merry Christmas, Eliza," he said. She went to bed and lay in her small room with the carved bear on the windowsill, and the new gloves folded on the dresser, and her heart so full it was almost uncomfortable. And she thought about the tin box and the cold, empty bed, and the single boot he had left behind, and she felt something like gratitude, an unexpected and unlikely gratitude, toward Thomas Calloway for being exactly who he was, because the path he had set her on without meaning to had led her here. January was hard in the way that Kansas Januaries are hard, uncompromising and brutal and requiring everything you had, and Eliza gave everything she had. There were 2 weeks when the temperatures dropped so low that the goats had to sleep in the cabin itself, 2 of them penned in the corner by the wood stove with a resigned acceptance that suggested this was not their first winter in close quarters with humans. There were days when the cold required her to make 3 trips to the woodshed before noon, and days when the snow came sideways and the world beyond the windows ceased to exist entirely. She was not frightened. That surprised her. She had thought she might be frightened, had thought she might feel the isolation as a trap, but instead she felt it as a kind of simplicity, the world reduced to its essentials, fire and food and shelter and warmth, everything else stripped away. Caleb was extraordinary in the winter. He moved through the cold with complete competence, never ruffled, never anxious, checking the animals and the structures with a thoroughness that was deeply reassuring. He came in from the bitter mornings, stamping snow from his boots and filling the wood box without being asked, and he was a physical force of warmth and steadiness in the cabin in a way that had nothing to do with sentiment and everything to do with the simple fact of a large, strong, capable man who knew exactly what to do. She told him one evening, when they were sitting by the fire after supper with the temperature howling outside, "I do not know how people do this alone." He was quiet for a moment. "I used to wonder the same thing," he said. She looked at him. "But you did it." "I did." He looked at the fire. "It is harder than it looks." She wanted to ask him if it was better now with her here. She did not ask. She thought she already knew the answer. It was a Wednesday in the second week of January when he kissed her. He had been out since before dawn checking on a section of fence that had come down in a storm the previous night, and he had come back after mid-morning in worse condition than she had ever seen him, cold all the way through, a cut on his forearm from the fencing wire, his face raw and set with the particular expression of a man who has been fighting the elements for several hours and has not entirely won. She brought him to the wood stove and made him sit while she poured hot coffee, and then, without thinking about it too carefully, unwrapped the piece of cloth he had tied around the cut on his forearm. It was not deep. She cleaned it and bound it with steady hands while he sat still and let her do it, his arm across his knee, her hands on his arm. He was watching her face while she worked. She could feel it. When she finished binding the cut, she looked up. He was very close. His face was right there, serious and intent, and his amber eyes were looking at her with an expression that had come entirely uncovered, all the careful containment of the last month simply gone, and she recognized what she was seeing, because she had been trying not to look at it directly for weeks. She was still holding his arm. "Eliza," he said. "Yes," she said, though he had not asked a question. He leaned forward and kissed her. It was careful at first, a question, and then she answered it by leaning into him, and it became something else, something warm and sure and deeply felt, and his hand came up to the back of her head with a gentleness that was, somehow, the most affecting thing about it, that those enormous, careful hands could hold something as though it were precious. When they broke apart, she kept her eyes closed for a moment. "I have wanted to do that since November," he said. His voice was lower than usual. "Since the wagon," she said. "In December." He made a sound, low and a little startled, something between a laugh and a groan. "Before that," he said. She opened her eyes and looked at him. His face was so open. She had never seen it so open. "I've been falling in love with you," she said, because after 6 weeks of frost it seemed ridiculous to be indirect about it. "Since you put a lock on that door." He looked at her for a long moment. "Because I put a lock on the door?" "Because of why you put it on," she said. "Because you understood why it mattered." He reached up and tucked a strand of hair away from her face with enormous care, and looked at her with those gold-amber eyes, and said, "I am not an easy man to live with." "You are the easiest man I have ever been near," she said, completely truthfully. That seemed to undo something in him. He kissed her again, and this time there was nothing careful about it. It was warm and certain and full of everything that had been building since October, and she kissed him back with the same complete certainty, her hands against his chest, feeling the solid reality of him like solid ground under her feet. The goats, still in their pen in the corner, watched this development with complete equanimity. February came, and the world was ice and white fire, and Eliza was happy in a way that she had not believed was possible 4 months ago. She and Caleb had arrived at a new arrangement that was not so different from the previous one in its practical rhythms, but was entirely different in its essential nature. They moved through the cabin and the work and the cold days with the easy closeness of people who have stopped pretending they are not already each other's. He was, in love, what she had suspected he would be. Completely present, deeply attentive in the ways that mattered, occasionally inept at the things that required words, but remarkably good at the things that did not. He would reach for her hand when they were sitting in the evenings by the fire, not dramatically, just quietly, the way you reach for something that belongs beside you. He brought her things, small things, a piece of quartz he found that had the color of her eyes, a hawk feather from the ridge, more cedar bundles, as though he had been collecting things for her without knowing why for months and was now at liberty to give them all at once. He told her one night about his father, a hard, cold man from the eastern mountains who had not believed in warmth and had made everyone around him prove they deserved it. He told her in the same steady, flat voice he used for most things, but she heard the weight behind it, the years of it, and she held his hand and said nothing until he was finished, and then said, "I think that is why you are so deliberate about kindness. You know the cost of its absence." He was very quiet for a long time. Then, "That might be the most honest thing anyone has said to me." In the 3rd week of February, he asked her. They had been walking on the ridge above the cabin after a brief mid-afternoon break in the cloud cover, their breath white in the cold air, the snow-covered hills rolling out in every direction in that particular winter light that made everything look as though it had been carved from silver. He had her hand, as he usually did when they walked together, his big thumb running in small circles over her knuckles, in a way he probably did not know he was doing. He stopped at the granite outcropping, the same place he had shown her the sunset in October, before any of this, when she was still the woman who had been left with nothing, and he was still the man who had given her a job and a locked door and $12 a month. He was looking out at the hills. He had something in his coat pocket that she had not asked about and was not asking about now, though she was aware of it. "I'm not going to make a long speech," he said. "I'm not built for long speeches." "I know," she said. He turned to face her. In the winter light, with the snow on his shoulders and his long, dark hair pulled back and his face entirely open, he was the most striking thing she had ever seen. Not in the conventional ways of striking, but in the deeper way, the way that is about presence and solidity and the specific quality of a person who has decided to be completely honest. He reached into his pocket and produced a ring. It was not a bought ring. She could see immediately that it was handmade, silver wire that he had shaped himself, set with a small piece of that amber-colored stone that he sometimes found in the creek beds, smooth and warm-colored and exactly the shade of his eyes. "I made it," he said. "I know it is not what a jeweler would make." "It is exactly what I want," she said, and she meant that so completely that her voice wavered. "Eliza," he looked at her steadily, "I know you came here with nothing, and that I gave you a job, and I want to be very clear that what I am asking now has nothing to do with that. I'm asking because you are the first person I have ever met who made this place feel like a home instead of a place I live." He paused. "I would very much like you to stay. Not as a housekeeper, as my wife, if you want that." She took his face in both her hands, her small hands against his rough jaw, and looked at him for one long moment, and let herself see everything she had been looking at for months, the steadiness, the kindness, the quiet, enormous love that he had been showing her in 100 small ways before he knew how to say it in words. "Yes," she said, "with everything I have, yes." He put the ring on her finger. It fit. She suspected that was not an accident. He kissed her on the ridge in the February cold, with the silver hills all around them, and his arms around her so solid and warm that the cold outside them became irrelevant. And Eliza Calloway, who had stood 4 months ago in a rented room above a Dodge City saloon with an empty tin box and a single boot and 30 seconds of grief, felt the whole enormous architecture of her life rearrange itself into something completely new and entirely right. They were married in March, when the snow had begun to thin, and the first tentative green appeared in the south-facing hollows. Pearl made the journey out from town for it, bringing with her the preacher from the First Methodist Church in Dodge City, a lean elderly man named Reverend Marsh, who had married more frontier couples than he could count, and who performed the ceremony in the clearing in front of the cabin with a warmth and brevity that suited them both exactly. Eliza wore the best dress she owned, a blue wool dress that Pearl had helped her take in at the waist and add a lace collar to, transforming it from practical to something with at least ceremonial intent. Caleb wore his good shirt and his clean dark trousers and had his hair tied back neatly and looked at her when she came out of the cabin with an expression she would remember for the rest of her life, complete and utter certainty mingled with a wonder he could not entirely contain. Pearl cried. She was entirely unapologetic about it and produced a handkerchief from her coat with the efficiency of a woman who had planned on crying. "I, Caleb Holt, take you, Eliza," he said when the moment came, his voice steady and direct as all his words were, "to be my wife, to work beside you and provide for you and stand between you and anything that would harm you for every day I have remaining." She was not going to cry. She had decided this. She looked at this big, steady, extraordinary man, and she cried anyway, quietly, and he lifted his thumb and wiped one tear from her cheek with the same gentleness he had used to hold her face on that cold January morning. "I, Eliza, take you, Caleb Holt," she said, "to be my husband, to love you and keep your house in your heart, and to remind you when you forget that you are the best man I know." Pearl made a sound that was half laugh and half sob. Reverend Marsh pronounced them man and wife, and Caleb kissed her and lifted her off the ground slightly when he did it, and Pearl cheered and clapped, and the horses in the pasture lifted their heads at the sound, and the March wind came across the hills carrying the first real warmth of the year, and Eliza Holt, she said the name to herself, tasting it, finding it fit perfectly, stood in the sun in front of the cabin that would be entirely her home, and felt joy so clean and complete it was almost startling. Pearl stayed for the wedding supper, and they ate and talked until the stars came out thick and cold above the hills, and Pearl hugged Eliza tightly before climbing back into her wagon. "I always know," Pearl said into her ear. "You do," Eliza agreed, laughing. Take care of each other, Pearl called back as she drove away. We will, Caleb said, and he put his arm around Eliza's shoulders as they stood on the porch, watching the wagon lights shrink into the dark. That spring was the most beautiful season Eliza had ever known. After the long winter, the land came alive with a speed and exuberance that felt personal. The hills going green in sheets, wildflowers appearing in the grasslands overnight, the creek running high and clear and cold with snowmelt, the cottonwoods putting out their first yellow-green leaves in a delicate, trembling display that lasted only a week before giving way to the full leaf. She started a proper kitchen garden, more ambitious than the small patch that had been there before, double the size, laid out in neat rows that she planned over the winter in the back pages of her ledger, ordering seeds from the catalog Pearl carried at the store. Caleb built her a fence for it without being asked, putting it in one morning while she was inside, and she came out to find him driving the last post, sawdust on his shirt, and she felt such a surge of love for him that it was almost physical. He had also begun, at her gentle suggestion, taking his carvings more seriously. What had been a winter evening habit became a small but real income. Pearl sold them as fast as he made them, and had written to a trading house in Kansas City that had expressed interest in larger quantities. He had begun in the evenings after supper, carving with a new intentionality, trying new subjects, horses, eagles, the particular form of a buffalo he had seen once years ago on the northern plains, still vivid enough in his memory to render. Eliza kept the accounts for this too. She was good at it, and it pleased her. The ledger pages filling up with Caleb's careful handwriting recording trap yields and hide prices and carving sales, the small growing proof of a life that was working. She had written to Pearl once, in a letter she had not been sure she would send, that the most surprising thing about her new life was that she felt useful in it, not in the grinding way of someone needed because no one else was available, but genuinely useful, genuinely part of something. In April, she discovered she was pregnant. She had suspected for 2 weeks before she told him, not because she was afraid of his reaction, but because she wanted to be sure, and because she wanted a moment, just a moment, to hold this knowledge alone, the knowledge that life was building something new inside her with the same quiet confidence with which Caleb had built his cabin. She told him on a Sunday evening. They were sitting on the porch after supper watching the sunset do its extravagant best over the western hills, and the light was on his face, and she was holding her coffee cup, and she simply said, "I think we are going to need a larger cabin by autumn." He looked at her. She watched the comprehension cross his face, moving slowly at first and then all at once like a wave, and then he was entirely still for one long suspended moment. "Are you certain?" he said. "Fairly certain," she said. "November, I think." He set down his coffee cup very carefully on the porch railing, and then he turned to her and he took both her hands in his and held them with that extraordinary gentleness, and he said roughly, "Eliza." "Yes," she said, smiling, her eyes wet. He pulled her close and held her for a long time, his arms around her, his face against her hair. And he said nothing because he was the kind of man who felt the things words were insufficient for too deeply to try to capture them in words. She felt him breathing. She felt his heartbeat. She felt the entirety of the life they were building together, pressing in around her with the solidity of something that was not a dream, but a fact. "I am going to need more wood," he said eventually, into her hair. She laughed out loud, her whole body shaking with it, and he held her through the laughter and laughed too. He began building the addition the following week. He planned it over several evenings at the kitchen table, with drawings he made in pencil on brown paper, a second sleeping room, larger than the current one, and a small room beyond that which could serve as a nursery. He was methodical about it, as he was about all physical things, measuring twice and thinking for long periods before picking up a tool. He also rode into Dodge City midweek and came back with a letter he had sent to his one remaining relation, an older cousin in Tennessee named Warren, who he had not corresponded with in years. Eliza asked about it that evening, and he was quiet for a moment and then said, "I wanted someone to know, on my side, that I have a family now." She had to set down her sewing for a moment to compose herself. Pearl came out the following Saturday with a basket of things for the baby, fabric for small garments, a set of carved wooden animals from a craftsman in Dodge City, and her own thoroughly experienced opinions on childbirth, which she delivered with the authority of a woman who had attended more frontier births than most doctors. She also brought news from town, the kind of news that was just life, who had arrived, who had left, what the summer looked like for the cattle drives. She also brought a piece of news that landed differently. Thomas Calloway came through Dodge City last week, Pearl said, watching Eliza carefully over her coffee cup. The name hit Eliza like cold water, not with the force it once would have, but with a residual shock, a muscle memory of pain. "Is that so?" she said. Her voice was even. "The girl he ran off with," Pearl said. "Left him. Apparently she went back to her father in Wichita in January, and he has been following cattle drives since." A pause. He looked poorly. Eliza was quiet. Then, "I'm sorry for his suffering." Pearl raised an eyebrow. "I am," Eliza said. "I do not wish him harm. I just do not wish him anything, really. Is that terrible?" "Not at all," Pearl said. Caleb, sitting at the table with his pipe, said nothing. He had gone very still when Pearl said the name, the stillness of a man who is choosing very deliberately not to react, and Eliza glanced at him and saw the line of his jaw and reached over and put her hand over his where it rested on the table, and she felt him breathe and felt the tension ease. "He is the past," she said to Pearl, but also to Caleb. "There is too much of the present to be interested in the past." Pearl smiled, long and slow and deeply satisfied. "I believe that is exactly right," she said. Thomas Calloway had no more space in Eliza's life after that. She thought of him occasionally, the way you think of a road you did not take, not with longing or anger, just with the vague awareness that it existed somewhere, going its own direction. What he had taken from her had led her here. She was not foolish enough to be grateful for his cruelty, but she was honest enough to acknowledge that the path out of it had brought her to the best place she had ever been. Summer came in gold and green and overwhelming. The kitchen garden was a triumph, tomatoes and beans and squash and rows of root vegetables that would see them well through another winter. The wildflowers grew knee-high in the meadow below the cabin, and Eliza walked through them in the mornings and cut armfuls for the windowsills, filling the cabin with color that made Caleb look at the vases with the expression of a man who has forgotten that rooms can look like this. He was attentive to her pregnancy in the way she had known he would be, practically and thoroughly, without fuss. He adjusted the work she did without making her feel as though she were being managed, taking on the heavier tasks himself, making sure she rested in the afternoons, checking with Pearl on his town trips about what she should and should not be doing, then coming home and implementing Pearl's advice with the same methodical efficiency he brought to everything. She caught him once in the new room he had built, finishing the cradle he had made from pine. A beautiful thing, rocking gently on its curved base, smooth and perfectly made, with small carved vines running along the headpiece that she recognized as his particular vocabulary, the same careful touch that was in the bear on her windowsill and all the pieces Pearl sold at the store. He was sanding the last rough edge when she appeared in the doorway, and he looked up, in his face, in the summer afternoon light coming through the new window, was so nakedly happy that she had to press her hand to her mouth. "It is perfect," she said. "It needs one more coat of oil," he said, running his thumb along the wood. He looked at it with the expression of a man who has made something for the most important reason he has ever had. She crossed the room and put her arms around him from behind, pressing her face against the warmth of his back, and felt his hands come down over hers. "We are going to be fine," she said, not because she doubted it, but because some truths need to be spoken aloud. "We are," he said with complete conviction. The baby came in early November, exactly a year after Eliza had arrived at Caleb's cabin as his housekeeper, with a carpet bag and a wooden box and a heart full of careful scar tissue. Pearl came out a week before the due date and stayed. She had attended more than enough frontier births to be more useful than any doctor, and Eliza trusted her completely. The labor was long and hard, a November night with the fire high and the wind in the pines, and Caleb sitting just outside the bedroom door because Pearl had drawn the line firmly at his presence during the delivery itself, though the sounds from inside the room every time he heard Eliza in pain clearly cost him something considerable. Pearl went out twice to check on him and found him both times sitting with his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands, utterly helpless in the way that strong, capable people are utterly helpless in the face of the one thing they cannot fix by force of will. "She is doing well," Pearl told him each time. "She is stronger than you think." "I know she is strong," he said very quietly the second time. "I just need her to be safe." At just past 3 in the morning, with the November dark complete outside and the stars extraordinary above the frozen hills, Eliza Holt delivered a son. He was healthy and loud, and had, from the first moments, an impressive set of opinions about the world, which he communicated at volume. Caleb came in when Pearl opened the door, and he crossed the room in 3 strides and sat on the edge of the bed where Eliza lay, exhausted and radiant, with the baby wrapped and sleeping against her chest. He looked at his son, really looked, with those amber eyes that never missed anything, memorizing every detail. And then he looked at Eliza with an expression she had never seen on any face before, and suspected she would never fully be able to describe. "He is beautiful," he said, in a voice like gravel and water. "You're both all right?" "We are both wonderful," Eliza said. He reached out and touched the baby's face with one finger, just the tip with that extraordinary gentleness, and then he took Eliza's free hand and held it, and she felt him shaking slightly. "James," she said. She had told him months ago that she wanted to name a son James after her father. He had told her then that he thought it was a fine name. "James Holt," he said, tasting it. "Hello, James." The baby, at the sound of his father's voice, opened his eyes briefly, dark and unfocused in the way of newborns, but oriented somehow toward the sound, and Caleb sat very still, as though afraid to disrupt whatever connection had just been made. Pearl left them and went to make coffee, and Eliza watched Caleb looking at his son in the lamplight, and she thought about everything that had had to break and fall and fail for her to end up in this room, in this cabin, with this man and this child. And she thought, nothing is wasted, not even the worst of it, not if it leads you here. "Caleb," she said softly. He looked at her. "I love you," she said. "I want you to know that I am not saying it because of tonight, though tonight is extraordinary. I say it because it is the truest thing about my life right now." He leaned forward and pressed his forehead to hers, the baby between them, and stayed there for a long, quiet moment. "I love you," he said. "I have loved you since you reorganized my larder and managed to make it look like you were doing me a favor." She laughed, exhausted and happy, and James stirred at the laugh and made a small searching sound, and Caleb straightened and watched the baby with an expression that was entirely undone, entirely open, a mountain brought gently to its knees. The winter after James arrived was different from the previous one, fuller, louder in the small, sharp ways that a baby makes a house loud, more tired and more alive simultaneously. Caleb adapted to fatherhood with the same deliberate competence he brought to everything, learning the weight and rhythm of his son with patient attention, getting up in the night without complaint, walking James for hours when the baby's early evening fussiness demanded it, a large man pacing the small cabin in the firelight with an infant pressed against his chest and a look of focused calm on his face. He made James more carvings, a horse, a dog, a small carved wagon that the baby could not yet hold, but that sat on the shelf in the nursery with the other animals, waiting. Eliza recovered well. By the time James was 6 weeks old, she was back to her routines. Though more loosely managed, the cabin absorbed the new reality with the adaptability of a place that was fundamentally in good order, and the good order made space for the chaos of an infant without losing its essential nature. They celebrated Christmas that second year with James in his cradle by the fire, wide awake and profoundly interested in the pine branches on the mantel, reaching for the light they cast with fat, uncoordinated hands. Pearl came out again and brought the carved animals from town and a soft woolen blanket she had made herself over the autumn, and Reverend Marsh sent his regards. Caleb made gingerbread. He had, over the months, begun to help in the kitchen with an ease that surprised him and delighted Eliza, learning to be useful in the domestic space with the same patient attention he brought to all skills, and he put the black pepper in because he remembered, and it was right. They sat by the fire that Christmas Eve with the baby asleep between them on the settee. Caleb had built a settee, a wide, low, comfortable thing, in the autumn, and Eliza had her head against Caleb's shoulder and his arm was around her, and the fire was orange and gold, and the pines outside the windows held their snow with silent patience. "This time last year," Eliza said, "James was not yet in the world. And the year before," Caleb said, "you had just arrived." She looked up at him. "What were you thinking when Pearl told you about me?" He was quiet for a moment, looking into the fire. "She said there was a woman who was capable and in trouble. I thought I would give it one more try and find someone who would not leave." A pause. "I did not expect—" He stopped. "What?" she asked. "Someone who would make this a home," he said simply. "I had a house. I did not know it was missing what it was missing until you arrived." She turned to press her face against his shoulder for a moment. He held her closer. James made a small, contented sound in his sleep. The year that followed was the building of a life in all its practical, specific, unheroic glory. The spring planting and the autumn harvest, the trapping seasons and the trading runs to Dodge City, the evening hours at the table with the lamp burning and James on the quilt on the floor learning to sit and then to crawl, and then, at 10 months, to pull himself upright against the legs of chairs and look around with an expression of tremendous self-satisfaction. Caleb sold his carvings to the Kansas City trading house for the first time that spring. The order was larger than either of them had expected, and the payment was substantial, more in a single transaction than the trapping had ever brought in over a winter. They sat across from each other at the kitchen table with the payment in Caleb's hands and looked at each other. "We could extend the barn," Eliza said. "I was thinking about a proper workshop," Caleb said, "for the carving, so I'm not doing it at the kitchen table." She smiled. "I was also thinking about a larger kitchen." He smiled back. "I was also thinking about that." They built both over the summer, the workshop and the larger kitchen extension, with help from 2 men Caleb hired from Dodge City for the heavier work, and Pearl came out when the kitchen was finished and walked through it with her hands on her hips and a look of genuine satisfaction on her face. "You have made something here," Pearl said. "We have," Eliza said. In the late summer of that second full year, Eliza discovered she was pregnant again. She told Caleb at the kitchen table in the same matter-of-fact way she told him most things, and he stood up from the table and came around to her and pulled her up out of her chair and held her with James on his hip, the 3 of them together, and she felt his heartbeat against hers and felt James's small hand patting her head with the determined affection of a toddler. "Hello," Caleb said into her hair. "Hello," she said back. Pearl, when told, pointed out that this was becoming a pattern. She said this with enormous approval. The second baby, a boy again, to their delight, arrived the following April. They named him Thomas after Eliza's father's middle name because the name deserved reclaiming, and called him Tom. He was a different baby from James in every respect. Calmer, observational, watching the world from his cradle with dark amber eyes that were entirely Caleb's. Caleb looked at those eyes on the first night and said, quietly, that he had not known it was possible to see yourself in another person and find it something to be glad about. James, at 17 months, greeted his brother with the cautious interest of a scientist studying a new specimen, poking him gently on the cheek, and then looking at Eliza with an expression that suggested he had expected more impressive results. Caleb watched this and laughed the real laugh, the full warm one, and Eliza thought she would never get tired of that sound. 3 years after Eliza Calloway had stood in a rented room above a Dodge City saloon with a cold, empty bed and an emptied tin box and 30 seconds of grief, she stood on the porch of her home in the late afternoon of an October day. October, a year full circle and more, the same gold light and the same smell of cold beginning to come in from the north, and watched her husband cross the meadow below the cabin with James on his shoulders and Tom in the crook of his arm, the big man moving through the long golden grass with 2 small boys, and an expression on his face that was completely at peace. The hills were the color of old coins. The cottonwoods were gold again. The kitchen behind her smelled of stew and wood smoke, and the cradle in the nursery was empty because Tom had outgrown it, and Caleb had already begun sketching plans for the small bed he would build next, and James had said his first complete sentence last week, which had been, with excellent priorities, "Papa Big." Caleb looked up from the meadow and saw her on the porch and raised his free hand. She raised hers. Tom, 3 months old and theoretically asleep, made a small sound that suggested he had opinions about being carried. James, from his perch on Caleb's shoulders, made a sound of supreme contentment. She watched them come up through the meadow and thought about all the words she had learned for what she felt: love, home, safety, belonging, and found them all true and all insufficient, the way the best truths always are. She thought about the women she knew in Dodge City who had nothing, who navigated that frontier world alone or worse than alone, and she felt the injustice of it with a sharp clarity. Not all of them would get this, and they deserved to. The frontier was brutal and beautiful, and it asked everything of you and was not fair about who it broke and who it held up. She had been lucky in the end. She knew that. She did not confuse luck with desert, but she had also been brave in that rented room, in those 4 days of no work and no money. She had been brave at Pearl's store, deciding to trust a large, quiet stranger on the strength of one woman's word. She had been brave in all the small ways that do not look like bravery but are, the ways you get up and go on when there's nothing obvious to get up and go on for. Caleb came up the porch steps, and she took Tom from him. The baby made a face of mild grievance at being transferred and then settled against her, and Caleb lifted James down from his shoulders and set him on the porch, where the boy immediately engaged with great seriousness in the project of examining an interesting piece of bark. Caleb stood beside Eliza and looked out at the hills in the last light. "Good day?" she asked. "Good day," he said. He put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and Tom, between them, made a sound of absolute satisfaction. "I was thinking," Eliza said, "about the first night, the cornbread. You said it was good." He looked down at her. "It was good." "You said you usually only made beans," she said. "I did," he said. "I thought about that for a long time," she said. "About a man who could build all of this." She gestured at the cabin and the workshop and the barn and the garden, and was living on beans. "I was waiting," he said. She looked at him. "For what?" He met her eyes, those amber eyes in the October light, full of everything: the lost Tennessee winters and the long Kansas solitude and the 11 years of making his way in a country that did not hand you anything for free, and the 3 years since she had arrived with a carpetbag and reorganized his larder and James and Tom and the cradle he had built and the ring he had made with his own hands, and every morning of fire and coffee and the particular domestic grace of a life in common. "For this," he said simply, "all of it. I just did not know that was what I was waiting for." She held his gaze and felt the truth of it settle through her like warm water. Behind them, James had abandoned the bark and was banging cheerfully on the porch railing. Tom had fallen asleep against her chest, his small hand fisted in her collar. The hills were burning gold, and the first star was out above the ridge, small and steady and already determined. "Well," Eliza Holt said, her head against her husband's shoulder with their youngest son between them and the whole of their life ahead of them in the clear October evening, "you do not have to wait any more." And he held her tighter, and the wind came across the hills smelling of cold and pine and the distant promise of snow. And somewhere in the meadow a coyote called once into the darkening sky, and the cabin windows glowed warm and gold against the coming night, and it was, in every way that mattered, exactly enough.